Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Sébastien Pérouse. I'm a research professor working with the Central Asia program at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at GW. So welcome everyone to the Central Asian program seminars. So today we have an exceptional panel, to address a very important topic, which is religious freedom in Uzbekistan. Since independence, the religious situation in Uzbekistan has been the subject of many discussions. And under the regime of late President Islam Karimov, human rights organizations criticized the state of religious freedom in Uzbekistan. And current President Shahid Mirziyoyev has made efforts and improved the situations. And these efforts have been welcomed by the international community. Uzbekistan had been designated as a country of particular concern under the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998 since 2006 for having engaged in or tolerated particularly severe violations of religious freedom. But in recognition of improvements under President Mirziyoyev, Uzbekistan was moved up to the special watch list in 2018, and it was removed from the special watch list and further upgraded in 2020 after the State Department determined that it no longer engaged in severe violations of religious freedom. Nevertheless, in 2021, USCIRF recommended that Uzbekistan be put back on the special watch list due to concerns of backsliding, and the religious situation in Uzbekistan continues to face criticism, including in reports of international NGOs. So this seminar today is based on one of these reports published in 2021 by the USCIRF, the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, and which is entitled Uzbekistan's Religious and Political Prisoners. And we decided to take today the opportunity of the translation of this report into Uzbek and Russian to hold this event. So this seminar aims to analyze on the basis of a constructive dialogue the religious situation in Uzbekistan and possible areas for improvement. So for this, we were able to assemble really an exceptional panel with USCIRF Chair Nadine Menza, the author of this report, Steve Swerdlow, the UN Rapporteur, Professor Ahmed Shahid, Ambassador Vahabov of Uzbekistan in DC, and Professor Elizabeth Clark, who is working at Brigham Young University. So I want to thank you all really for agreeing to participate in this panel, because I know that the five of you are extremely busy. Each panelist will speak between 10 and 15 minutes. I will kindly ask our panelists not to talk more than 15 minutes so that afterwards we have time for a Q&A session with the audience. So for the audience, please feel free to send me your question in the chat box. So we're going to start with Nadine Menza, who is a noted speaker, writer, and policy expert with more than 2 decades of experience as an advocate for working families and a champion for international religious freedom. Nadine Menza is a president of Patriot Voices, where she provides her expertise to shape the organization's special emphasis on public policies that support working families. Since June 2021, she has served as the chair of the USCIRF. She served as vice chair in 2019. She has represented USCIRF in delegations to many countries around the world, and she currently serves on the board of directors for the Institute for Global Engagement, the Singer Academy, and the Freedom Research Foundation. Previously, she was chairman of Hardwired Global, an organization working to stop religious oppression around the world. Nadine has advised several major organizations on faith engagement, policy development, and strategic partnership. She has served as a senior advisor to presidential and Senate campaigns, and she worked on Capitol here in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. And Nadine's writing on various policy topics have been published in many, many publications domestically and internationally. So again, thank you all for being with us. And Nadine, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today. Thanks so much to you, Professor Sebastian Pieruz, and to the Central Asia Program for having me and hosting this timely event on the state of religious freedom in Uzbekistan. I'm so honored to be a part of this distinguished panel. If I had to assemble a dream team on this subject, these friends and experts would be who I would choose. So I'm really looking forward to hearing from each of them and, of course, the conversation. I'm happy that it was able to coincide with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedoms, or USCIRF's, release of our report, Uzbekistan's Religious and Political Prisoners, Addressing a Legacy of Repression, that Steve Swerdlow put together, that was just released in Uzbek and Russian languages, and you can find them at uscirf.gov. I'm really looking forward to what I know is going to be an important discussion. As a quick intro, USCIRF is an independent, bipartisan U.S. government advisory body created by the 1998 International Religious Freedom Act, or IRFA. USCIRF uses international standards to monitor religious freedom around the world and makes policy recommendations to the US government. In my 4 years at USCIRF, the opportunity to see such dramatic changes for religious freedom space in Uzbekistan has truly been a highlight. It has been encouraging to see both the government of Uzbekistan and the embassy here in DC pay real attention to these issues, take initiative to introduce reforms, dialogue with partners in the international community, including USCIRF, throughout this entire process. There is still work to be done, but it has been a personal privilege to witness these changes and work with the government to improve the conditions for religious freedom for all. I just returned from Uzbekistan this past weekend, leading the USCIRF delegation with Vice Chair Nuri Turkel and professional staff Keely Becken and Jamie Staley. We were so appreciated the open dialogue with officials in various ministries and positions throughout the government. We also engaged with civil society, human rights defenders, and representatives of Uzbekistan's many diverse religious communities. It was a productive and insightful visit and proved to be a timely opportunity following Uzbekistan's adoption last year of a revised religion law to take stock of the progress so far and evaluate where additional steps can be taken. While the last few years were focused on reforming legislation, we hope that moving forward, the government will continue to look for ways to improve people's lived experiences when it comes to being able to practice and express their religious beliefs. For instance, we had the opportunity to visit a number of houses of worship, including a closed Shia mosque in Bukhara, and the local Shia community is trying to reopen, and a Buddhist temple threatened by an ongoing construction project. We also visited a Baptist church that had been badly damaged and unable to function, but we're encouraged to hear local authorities make a commitment for renovations in the coming months. Although the government's changes to the religion law sought to simplify the process for mandatory registration for religious communities, no non-Muslim religious communities have been able to register within the last year since the adoption of this law. There are numerous religious communities interested in obtaining registration that have encountered obstacles at the local level. Government bodies such as the Committee on Religious Affairs and Ministry of Justice should step in and help communities navigate the registration process to ensure that those applications make their way through the system and are not stuck or blocked from achieving official registration through no fault of their own. We're encouraged to hear of ongoing criminal code reform, decriminalizing or lessening the severity of punishments for Article 216 and 244 and others that deal with religious organizations, teaching religion, and other freedom of expression in religion would be a positive development. We were troubled by the sentencing of blogger Vazeholia Arihojeyev for 7.5 years over a post about Muslims congratulating non-Muslims on their holidays, and also for fining journalists who published on religious subjects without government approval. And finally, as we expressed in USCIRF's report on this specific issue last fall, the government should take a systematic approach to reviewing the cases of the many individuals imprisoned in connection with their religious activities or affiliations. I've personally seen the government be responsive in the cases of particular prisoners and believe that this would mark a crucial next step in the government's continued reform efforts. Many of the prisoners documented in USCIRF's report were imprisoned under the previous government, and in many cases subjected to lack of due process, torture, and resentencing. While the government has commendedly released some prisoners, we would ask them to carefully consider the cases of the 81 individuals profiled in USCIRF's report. We hope that its release in Uzbek and Russian will help facilitate these issues as well. It is important to acknowledge that even after our reporting, the government of Uzbekistan welcomed our USCIRF delegation and continues to openly dialogue about these issues. Even today, having Ambassador Vahabov join our panel shows a genuine commitment and dedication to continued reforms. I share these recommendations with the deepest affection for Uzbekistan, and I hope the continued religious freedom reforms will help to ensure that this beautiful country prospers. And I look forward to hearing from my colleagues here in our continued discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for your introduction, for your presentation. We're now going to move to the author of the report, Steve Swerdlow. Steve is Associate Professor of the Practice of Human Rights in the Department of Political and International Relations at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. So Steve Swerdlow is a human rights lawyer and expert on the former Soviet Union. He was a senior Central Asian researcher at Human Rights Watch, heading the organization's work on Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, and founding its Kyrgyzstan field office. Steve has taught human rights as an adjunct professor at Webster University in Tashkent and worked as a consultant with the United Nations Development Program and the International Labour Organization. Earlier, Steve was a fellow in the US State Department's Young Leaders for Public Service program in Russia, and he worked as a human rights monitor for the Union of Council for Soviet Jews, as their South Caucasus monitor in Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, as well as with International Organization for Migration in Russia. So Steve practiced law in San Francisco at Leif Gebrauer, Heyman, Bernstein LLP, and served as law clerk to the Honorable Judge Dean Pregerson for the United States District Court for the Central District of California. Steve publishes regularly on human rights issues in Eurasia and US foreign policy. He received his JD from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law, and MA International Affairs from Columbia's University School of International and Public Affairs, with a certificate in post-Soviet studies from the Harriman Institute. So Steve, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Sebastian, thank you for the introduction. Thank you to the Central Asia program for hosting this. I fully agree with Nadine's assessment that this is a dream team, and particularly for me as the author of the report, it's really an honor. Thank you, Ambassador Vahabov, for finding the time to be on this panel. Thank you, Dr. Shaheed, Dr. Clark, and Nadine, and again, Sebastian. Let me start by saying, Hormatli hamkasblarimge katakon rahmat. I'm saying, esteemed colleagues, thank you so much for the report, for the support in the translation. What we're here to mark today is the translation of this report into Uzbek, which I think it's appropriate that we organize the event around this, because none of this knowledge or research or findings are really important unless they are accessible in Uzbek, to Uzbekistan, to the people of Uzbekistan, and form part of this ongoing conversation about freedom of religion. So I'm especially grateful to USCIRF. It is no small feat, and I see here we have a translator, Mark Rees, very well known for his translations into Uzbek. It is no small feat to translate a document that is over 71 pages into Uzbek and to Russian. And so I just want to start by saying that what I thought I'd do in my remarks was remark a bit on the significance of the translation, why I think it's important, then review some of the key findings of the report, and then finally maybe provide a few updates on individual prisoners. But I want to say that my esteemed co-panelists are truly trailblazers in the area of freedom of religion. Of course, Dr. Shaheed, known for his global experience on this issue, long expertise. Nadine, also very much a trailblazer, promoting religious freedom around the globe for so long, and Dr. Clark. And that is certainly the approach that I aspired to with this research, which is to contribute in a constructive way to a dialogue on a sensitive issue. And I should start again by saying that no panelist, I believe, on this roundtable would assert that there are no important national security concerns or challenges, I should say, that Uzbekistan faces in the realm of extremism and terrorism. That said, religious freedom is a core human rights obligation. And so that is the approach, I think, that underlines this research. I also want to underline again the cooperative relationship that characterized the conduct of this research. This was an over a year-long investigation. I spent, all told, more than 4 months on the ground in Uzbekistan, and in that time, I benefited from being able to meet with at least 8 or 9 Uzbek government agencies, including the prison administration, and had extensive consultations with the government. So starting with the significance of this report, I should say that beyond the information about the 81 prisoners that are documented in the report and some of the quantitative findings and some of the human rights findings about prison conditions, potential ill treatment and torture, I should say that one of the reasons I think it's so important this was translated today into Uzbek is because the backside of the report, the latter 30 pages or so, provides a history of the issues around religious freedom in Uzbekistan, including, I should say, the troubled relationship between President Karimov's policies on religion and Islam, between Islam and the government, which was a troubling relationship that began, or I should say, challenging one, including some of the fateful decisions, for example, in the aftermath of the 1999 February bombings in Tashkent, which were bloody and traumatic events for Uzbekistan. But in the aftermath of those events, there were policies that led to the imprisonment of a numerous group of peaceful religious believers. And as many on this Zoom are familiar, the policies that were unleashed at that time led to really a ballooning of the prison population, the religious prisoner population, leading to, by 2004, some estimates that there could have been up to around 7,000 peaceful religious believers in Uzbekistan's prisons. Now, that's a history that hasn't been told. We have amazing histories in English, like Adib Khalid's Making of Modern Uzbekistan. But it's important that these resources, these conversations happen in Uzbek and in Uzbekistan. So for me, it's particularly important, I think, from a perspective of, as we see reforms moving ahead in the realm of religious freedom in Uzbekistan, I think one way to ensure that reforms continue and that there is no backsliding is to avoid a revenge of the past is to discuss these policies, to look at these issues from a historical and transitional justice perspective, in addition to discussing the current state of reforms, which have been dynamic and, as Nadine said, have been quite positive in many ways. So I think that's very, very important from the perspective of transitional justice and ensuring that these reforms can continue. Now, the basic findings of the report were that as of November 2020, there were about 23,000 prisoners in Uzbekistan, which is a significant reduction from 2014, in which there were about 44,000 prisoners. Now, according to the research in this report, approximately 10% of that 23,000 prisoners were persons charged with extremism or terrorism, under articles mentioned by Nadine earlier, Article 159, Article 244, for the possession or distribution of so-called extremist literature, also so-called anti-constitutional activity, Article 159. And it's good news that there's some discussion about perhaps reforming the criminal code in the coming year. I share and endorse those recommendations from Nadine. Now, what we don't know is exactly how many prisoners are in Uzbekistan's prisons on those charges, but what this research underlined is that a significant number of individuals were imprisoned without any evidence or connection to acts of violence, incitement to violence, or really credible evidence of violence. And so that was the core recommendation, was to revisit those cases, especially all cases related to those vague and overbroad articles of the criminal code. Now, one of the new findings to come out of this report was that the extension of sentences that occurred in prison was we previously knew that prisoners would have their sentences extended, what we called arbitrary extensions under Article 221, which were sometimes, especially in the Karima period, you would see prisoners fined or having their sentences extended by 5 years or 3 years for minor violations of the prison rules, such as not putting your slippers in the right corner of your cell or not maintaining the cleanliness of your cell. But what we didn't know was that there was a longer standing policy of resentencing people while in prison, often without access to counsel, inside the prison to second or third or fourth or fifth sentences, which would lead to people receiving an additional 15 years or an additional 16 years on top of 8 years or 9 years. And that was what led to the second finding of this report, which was that there was really a staggering length of sentences when we looked at this subpopulation of the prison population. So I'm talking about prison sentences in the area of 20 years, 25 years, and even 30 years, which is quite astounding and problematic. Now, the third finding was that some of these cases were multi-generational, that we would often find members of the same family. And I'll mention that in one of my updates, a happy update at the end of my presentation, that sometimes we would see enemies of the state coming from one family. Another finding was that many of the prisoners were extradited from other countries, and there was some sense of a transnational repression aspect. People extradited without due process from countries like Russia or Kyrgyzstan back to Uzbekistan. And then finally, again, going back to the first finding, the idea that many of these convictions were based on ideological characterization or purely ideological designations of people as violent extremists without any evidence connection to violence, that simply muddied the waters and again takes away from the legitimate security concerns that Uzbekistan faces in protecting itself from violent ideology. There should be a distinction between extremism and violent extremism, or extremism in the ideological sense and extremism that's connected to credible evidence of violence. Now, finally, Sebastian, do I have a moment to provide a final update or so? 2 minutes? Just to provide some updates on the research, which I promised at the beginning. Just share a slide. Now, here we have a prisoner that was just released. I'm happy to report that among the 81 prisoners that we documented in this report, there have been some releases since this research was released in October 21. And that's something I'm particularly proud of, that USCIRF has, I think, really contributed to this discussion. Now, this prisoner, Avaz Takhtakhajayeb, is a really good example of this phenomenon of really lengthy detention without connection to violence. Now, he was thought to be a member of Hizb ut-Tahrir, designated as an extremist organization, not in the West, but in Uzbekistan. And according to this research, on purely ideological grounds, was arrested without a warrant, charged with the articles that I've mentioned here. Now about 72 or 73. He was tortured during his pretrial detention, and unfortunately, that's a finding that became routine among these 81 cases. And he had his sentence extended an astounding 5 times. Now, he was just released under the Navruz pardon that was issued within the past few weeks. He suffered numerous health ailments, and I hope he'll be rehabilitated and receive reparations. This is a really happy ending to this terrible story. Another update to provide: in the time since the report was released, that this individual, Muhyiddin Ergashev, is still in prison, but he had 2 sons. I mentioned that there was a multi-generational aspect in which families seem to be sometimes targeted on these charges. He is still in prison, but his sons, Sadorbek Ergashev was released, also Atabek Ergashev released. And so we have seen, there are some reports or some reports that a greater number of the 81 individuals have been released. I'm hoping for confirmation on that. But then just to remind us of who else is still in prison, I'll just end with this case, which is Kadir Yusupov, an ex-diplomat who was imprisoned in 2018, or detained in 2018, and actually imprisoned in January 2020. In June 2021, the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention stated that his detention was unlawful and that he should be immediately released. Now, the reason he's mentioned in connection with this case, even though in this report, even though he was imprisoned on espionage charges, is because he faced retaliation and ill treatment in prison when raising complaints that prisoners were not able to observe the Ramadan fast. He was retaliated against and beaten and tortured. And I really hope that that we will learn soon that he has been released as well. So there's more work to be done, but I want to commend the government of Uzbekistan for constructively engaging on these issues. And I hope to continue the research and go back to Uzbekistan shortly to do some follow-up work.
Thank you so much, Steve. So now we're going to move to Professor Ahmed Shaheed, who is a United Nations Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief. Professor Ahmed Shaheed is an internationally recognized expert on foreign policy, on international diplomacy, democratization, and human rights reform. Professor Shaheed assumed his mandate as Special Rapporteur on freedom of religion or belief in November 2016 and serves as a Deputy Director of the Essex Human Rights Center. He was the first Special Rapporteur of the Human Rights Council on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran since the termination of the previous Commission on Human Rights mandate in 2002. Professor Shaheed is a career diplomat. He has twice held the office of Minister of Foreign Affairs of Maldives. He led Maldives' efforts to embrace international human rights standards between 2003 and 2011. In 2015, Professor Shaheed won the United Nations Foundation Leonidas Human Rights Award. In 2010, he was granted a Presidential Medal of Gratitude by Albania. And in 2009, he was recognized as a Muslim Democrat of the Year by the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. Dr. Shaheed graduated from the University of Wales with a bachelor degrees in international politics and strategic studies in 1989, and he obtained his PhD in 1995 from the University of Queensland in Brisbane in the field of international relations. He's an avid writer and academic, and he has presented many papers at various international conferences covering topics as diverse as economic and development, terrorism, diplomacy, and democracy. So thank you so much, Professor Shaheed, for being with us today.
Thank you so much for that very generous introduction. Good morning to all. I want to begin by thanking George Washington University and especially Professor Sebastian Peruz for organizing this event and for inviting me to speak at this forum. I'm delighted to join this distinguished panel, as many have said, a dream team on Uzbekistan. And a special appreciation to Ambassador Javlon Wakabov for his continued efforts to promote dialogue between my mandate and his government, and of course, to work with all of us in promoting freedom of belief in the country and human rights in general. I was very pleased with the first UN monitor to have received an invitation to visit the country after a drought of 10 years. In 2017, shortly after President Shavkat Mirziyoyev began his tenure as President of Uzbekistan. And during my visit that year, and at my visit, I expressed my finding that the government had shown goodwill towards my visit and my work. And this was based on my assessment that I was able to go everywhere I wanted to go, meet anybody I wanted without any impediment, and get any information I asked for. And that met essentially my requirement for giving full cooperation to my mandate, in addition to giving me access to all senior government ministers and officials, including the president himself, whereby he was able to exchange views and of course make recommendations on my findings on what required to be done from my mandate's perspective. And then, of course, I was very pleased again at something unprecedented when I came out. The government issued a roadmap on implementing my recommendations almost verbatim. And that again is unprecedented in I think in UN system, certainly for me. And I was very much encouraged by that. I was further encouraged to have received invitations from the government to make recommendations to its draft law on disorganizations, which was enacted last year. And And while I made recommendations and while I noticed good progress coming out of the legislation, like others, I've also noted the gaps that are still out there and that needs to be addressed. And I am hoping that there's opportunity for us to work on this moving forward and that these gaps can be addressed as well. That said, I think we should not understate the achievement that the government of Uzbekistan has pursued and attained in this area. And I think well deserved the delisting by the US last year, beginning of last year, on its previous status of particular concern. Of course, since then, there have been backsliding, not again unusual in regard to countries that advance towards human rights, but nevertheless still worth engaging on and working on. Therefore, I think the continued dialogue is very important. So while I have noted that the law enacted last year enabled the registration of organizations working with religious freedom, religious organizations more easily, and there are not a lot more in the country now, there are, of course, significant challenges moving forward. And there are a few areas I want to highlight. And these are, of course, the fact that there is still no provision for practice of religious activities without being registered prior to that. This again doesn't conform to international standards. There should be, registration should make the beginning of one's ability to manifest one's faith. It only is a process to facilitate doing that. So I think there is a need to make sure that this is brought in line with those standards. The other, of course, is the restrictions on manifesting one's faith outside registered places of house of worship. Again, international standards is very clear that one should be able to manifest one's faith and or belief in ways that don't undermine public order and public safety. And within those requirements, there should be space for someone to do this freely. And then linked to this, of course, is the ban on peaceful missionary activity. Again, international standards are very clear here that there should be space for people to teach their religion. Of course, I recognize the limits that can be put on coercion and fraudulent activity, but nevertheless, as a standing rule, there should be space for missionary activity, space for presentism, one to teach one's religion to others and seek converts in a peaceful and persuasive manner. So the distinction in law in this area between what can be called coercive and fraudulent activity and what is peaceful should also help the country more sharply address the issues that are of concern to them. Then the final point that I have noted in my comments on the draft and then the current law is the ban on education on religious issues outside state institutions. And that again is a problem, also difficult to implement as well in practice, but nevertheless, the international standards here are that there should be more space to people to freely teach their religious knowledge to others without again undermining public order and public safety. Now, having, of course, beyond that, then there are issues with practice. And so the gaps in the law itself translate into practical challenges, but beyond that, there are issues with applying the law as it stands, and also applying even the new reforms that have been made. Now, I am mindful that, of course, that while these are wide-ranging changes, the implementation of these laws can be quite challenging. Other speakers have noted some of the legacy issues coming from the past, including the challenges faced by the post-independence experience with extremism, but we should be able to move away from them to ensure that the future lies in a way that is more human rights compliant, and therefore in a way that can actually be more conducive to longer-term stability and longer-term suppression of violent extremist action. So the gap here, again, I have a few issues I want to highlight here. One is, as Steve Swerdlow has just highlighted, the overly broad use of the concept of extremism and national security, and therefore result in over-criminalization of people, including very lengthy prison sentences, and of course the practice of increasing a prison sentence while they are in prison. And while I want to commend the government for the release of large numbers of detainees from prison in the years following my visit, including those who were on a watch list, I again have noticed a rise in the number of, if you like, extremism-linked arrests following changes in the region, especially since August with the fall of Kabul. So again, a greater height sensitivity to extremism, other extremism, therefore resulting in, again, I would say, unfortunate and significantly concerning rise in arrests in this regard. The other area, of course, of difficulty is the restrictions on religious symbols in public. There is, of course, the law now has enabled the wearing of hijab by women, but again, it is restricted. There are restrictions on its manifestations use in certain settings, including in educational context. Certainly, if one is worn in what is called an Islamic style. And in addition to that, there's also the issue of perhaps by rogue elements in law enforcement of compulsory shaving of beards of men, which again is seen as a symbol of religious manifestation. An area others have highlighted here, and that again is worth mentioning, is the difficulty or the intersection between expression and religious freedom, often using religious offense in some form as a way to suppress expression. We've seen a case of a blogger receiving a significant, the stringent sentence simply for wishing, a greeting, wishing a Christmas greeting. And again, there are other elements of where people expressing views which are contrary to those expressed by clerics, again face charges based on restrictions on expression. Now, having identified these, difficulties, I still want to stress the scope for that there is to move forward. I want to hear not the continued government's engagement with UN monitors. My colleague, Special Rapporteur on Countering Terrorism, was there recently. While her report documented many areas of concern, she also highlighted many areas of positive development and good practice in the country, which others can even emulate. Certainly, there is more to come. I understand Special Rapporteur, the other Special Rapporteurs who might be invited to come to the country as well. And beyond that, there are other international monitors who've already been able to go to the country, including many on this panel as well. And therefore, that openness is something we welcome and something we should encourage. So in concluding, I want to again commend the government for the good work it has done, but also again highlight the need to keep moving forward. Because as Steve Swerdlow said, the way to ensure we don't fall back is to make sure that we keep going forward. And so I think it's very important that the government remains open to revising legislation, including the one that was passed last year, as well as the penal code, which of course it is open to do, making sure that the penal code again complies with the government's aspirations to be human rights compliant and human rights respecting a country. So finally, I want to say that the very presence of Ambassador Wakab on this panel, where we are discussing in a very candid manner the country situation, again makes Uzbekistan stand out in the region as a country for its willingness to engage with us. And therefore I commend him. I also want to thank all the panelists for their collaboration with me on the work on Uzbekistan. I look forward to further engagement with the country and with you all in moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. So we'll now turn to Ambassador Varhamov, who since October 2017 has been Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Uzbekistan to the United States, and since November 2018, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of Uzbekistan to Canada, with residence in Washington, D.C. So Ambassador Varhamov graduated from the University of World Economy and Diplomacy in Tashkent. He has a long experience in foreign policy before taking this position from 2006 to 2011. Ambassador Varhamov was a chief consultant with National Security Council under the President of the Republic of Uzbekistan. From 2011 to 2013, he was Deputy Secretary of this council. In 2013, Ambassador Varhamov became director of the Institute of Strategic and Interregional Studies under the President of the Republic of Uzbekistan. And also until 2015, he was a Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Uzbekistan. And in 2017, he took the position of first Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. So Ambassador Varhamov, thank you so much for being with us today.
So many issues to cover, but I know well our time is very much limited, and I will do my best to try at least to touch upon every single issue that you colleagues raised today. So thank you, Dr. Perus, for inviting me to join distinguished speakers, all of whom I know as good friends and valuable partners. And I would like to particularly express my appreciation to Professor Ahmed Shaheed, who visited Uzbekistan as a special rapporteur in 2017 and was among first showed us how freedom of religion could be a vital investment for Uzbekistan reforms that led to adoption of a comprehensive roadmap that was actually turned into reality, drastically changing the religious freedom landscape in my country. And I deeply value our constructive cooperation with USCIRF, and particularly Chair Maenza, who guided us through many challenges, even over very sensitive issues, and regardless of their complexities. We've always managed to find the ways to solve them. And I can't stress enough how we are grateful to Dr. Elizabeth Clark for her invaluable insights and expertise that contributed significantly to the progress of religious freedom, legal improvements in Uzbekistan. And of course, I'm very happy to work with you, Steve, although we don't always agree with one another, but we remain open to constructive dialogue. And all of them were so supportive and instrumental in our path towards tangible progress in ensuring religious freedom in Uzbekistan, that in fact has been widely recognized. In the State Department's decision to remove Uzbekistan from the list of countries of particular concern and its watch list in December 2020 are important testaments. And answering to the main question of today's event, I would like to enumerate several major changes in our efforts to ensure the religious freedom in Uzbekistan. As it was earlier mentioned, we have simplified the procedure for registration of religious organizations. And so far we've registered 25 non-Muslim religious organizations, such as Evangelical Christian Church, Protestants, Baptists, and Light of the World Church, and many, many others. And since the adoption of this newly revised law, at least 9, as far as I know, non-Muslim religious organizations got the registration by the Justice Ministry as well. And I would like also to mention that the Council of Faith, the advisory body where every single voice of faith is heard now, expanded by the representatives of Jehovah's Witnesses, Union of Evangelical Church, Seventh-day Adventist Christians, and Full Gospel Church. And there are no raids, seizure of property, as well as detention of members of religious minorities that we admit we had before. And there are no restrictions on attending the places of worship, including by minor children. And moreover, the believers of Uzbekistan can freely celebrate all religious holidays. Year by year, Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha are celebrated on ever larger scale. Among Muslims taking this opportunity, I would like to invite you all to the interfaith iftar that we are celebrating on April the 20th at the Uzbekistan embassy. Joined by 10 prominent Uzbekistan imams visiting Washington, D.C., New York, Orlando, Chicago, and other US cities to celebrate Ramadan and the Eid al-Fitr, with our compatriots who are currently residing in the United States. And Easter, Christmas are widely celebrated among Christians in Uzbekistan, so Purim, Hanukkah among Jews, Nowruz among Baha'is and all people of Uzbekistan, as well as festivities dedicated to Buddha and Krishna and others. And prior to pandemic, Jehovah's Witnesses conducted a so-called memorial service of the death of Jesus Christ in Fergana, Karshi, and Urgej. So far, 5,000 men and women have been pardoned, and more than 20,000 removed from the lists of law enforcement agencies. Unlike previous years, and it became a good tradition for presidential pardons on the eve of Eid al-Fitr and Eid al-Adha. So we also introduced the procedure of exempting people from criminal responsibility who misguidedly joined to terrorist, extremist, and other banned organizations. And I'm very pleased to share with you that, that we've been able to introduce another good practice that has been recently established. So foreign missions, the Uzbekistan embassies serving abroad can accept the applications of those who had fled into exile. So forgiveness and reintegration into normal life of those who were misguided is Uzbekistan's utmost priority. So this effort was the primary reason behind the decision of the President of Uzbekistan to conduct the humanitarian operations called Mehr, that is Mercy. And within 2 years, 5 such operations have been arranged, and so far we brought back home 531 Uzbek citizens, mainly women and children, who had been deceiving, into moving to extremist controlled areas in the Middle East. And we are providing them with all conditions, including through medical, psychological, and material assistance to getting them to reintegrate in their communities and of course, normal life. And in 2021, we've revised the 20 years old law on religious freedom, by significantly reducing bureaucratic hurdles, providing clear and exhaustive list of the grounds on which the registration of religious group can be denied. So removing the authority of the Minister of Justice to suspend the activities or liquidate religious organization, defining the objectives of expertise of materials of religious content solely with the purpose of preventing the spread of hateful ideas, call for violence or religious outrage, and many more. And a couple of years ago, all these accomplishments, I should underscore, were just unthinkable. And I would like to stress that it's not the end. So we understand and acknowledge some gaps that are still remaining, but my government, so this administration in Uzbekistan, has a strong political will to further advance religious freedom for all. And it's a gradual process in which we rely on your support, on our partners' understanding of a very delicate balance between religious freedom and national security concerns, especially now when the Central Asian region is facing a spread of radicalism, hatred, violence, and terrorist threat. So these threats have reaffirmed Uzbekistan's commitment to secularism and to the principles that all its citizens are equal under the law, regardless of race, language, or religion. And before, Dr. Pirous, before I enclose my remarks, just a couple of comments on what our distinguished panelists raised during today's conversation. So regarding the President's and the USCIRF report, we cannot agree with the most of findings of the report and its calculations that we believe stemmed from unsubstantiated facts, so personal assumptions and some sort of calculations. And I would like to avoid getting into other controversial conclusions, but in the meantime, I wanted just to emphasize that among those 81 stated in the report as so-called religious prisoners, at least 55 are members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, designated by law as terrorist organization. 25 are members of extremist group, jihadism, and it's proven that so at least 17 of them, according to the data that I was provided, intended to leave for Syria to fight against government forces. And I would like to stress that all these persons were convicted by law for committing serious crimes, not for expression of their views, and has nothing with their religious beliefs. And their guilt on committing violence was proven by courts based not only to testimonies and confessions of those criminals, but physical evidence obtained during due investigation. So, and I would like also to let you know that 13 prisoners have been released. So prior to this report in 2021, after serving their sentences, and by presidential pardons, and 4 were prosecuted in the form of restriction of freedom and remain at their place of residence. Again, just wanted to reiterate, so 13 of them had been released before this report was released by Steve. And in this regard, I think the list itself, all those 8 people should be double checked again. And I would like to stress that any convict, their lawyers and the representatives can appeal against court decisions and request a reconsideration of their cases. And it is their right, so guaranteed by law, and none of them are not deterred from going by anyone. So we are standing ready to thoroughly examine each of those cases. And my firm belief, that the adoption of the law, as I said before, is another achievement and the beginning of the new phase of the dialogue. And we look forward to continuing our collaboration with all our partners, focusing on effective laws implementation aimed at ensuring religious freedom, for everyone. And the last point, regarding the definition of extremism. Just the updates that I wanted to share with all of you. So at this moment, Interagency Commission, for the improvement of criminal and criminal procedure legislation of Uzbekistan, have drafted a new version of the criminal code, and the commission, this Interagency Commission, is currently considering to align the definition of extremism with international standards by just moving away from the concept of the so-called religious extremism. And at the end, I can't agree with the statement about remaining restrictions on religious attire. Today, more than ever before, you can see everywhere in public places, including educational facilities, young women and girls wearing hijab. And I believe Chair Mayans I witnessed while visiting my country last week as well. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Vahabov. I mean, it's extremely important for us, and I mean for all our panelists to have you today. We really wanted to hear you. I mean, to hear the voice of the Uzbek government, to give you a chance to answer some criticisms mentioned in the report. So now, I mean, last but not least, we'll have Professor Elizabeth Clark. I mean, Professor Clark is Associate Director of the International Center for Law and Religious Studies at Brigham Young University. She's a renowned expert on religious freedom in Eastern Europe and comparative law and religion. She has written over 40 chapters and articles and edited several books. Professor Clark has been featured on radio and public television shows in the US and internationally. She has spoken at United Nations and OSCE forums and over 100 academic conferences throughout the world. She has also testified before the US Congress and the USCIRF on religious freedom issues. She has taken part in drafting analysis of pending legislation affecting religious freedom in over a dozen countries. She has written amicus brief on religious freedom issues for the US Supreme Court. In addition to her work at BYU International Center for Law and Religious Studies, Professor Clark has taught professional responsibility and taught classes on comparative law, comparative constitutional law, international human rights, and European Union law at the Reuben Clark School of Law at Brigham Young University. Professor Clark is fluent in Russian and Czech. She has reading knowledge in French and German, and prior to joining the law school, she was an associate in the Washington, D.C. office of Mayor Brown and Platt, where she was a member of the Appellate and Supreme Court litigation group. Professor Clark also clerked for Judge Clifford Wallace on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit, and she graduated summa cum laude for BYU School, where she served as editor-in-chief of the BYU Law Review. So, Professor Clark, thank you so much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fudas. I appreciate you organizing this forum and very much appreciate all of my colleagues' comments. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be with each of you. And I'll echo what was said also about Ambassador Bahaba, how very generous of you to be here and be able to engage on these issues. Much, much appreciated. I'll say a few things that may wrap up a little, and I'll also sort of get into some of the things that are of my specialty, which is the legal side of religious freedom. I think I appreciate the report issued by USCIRF and authored by Steve Swerdlow. It's very valuable and detailed, and we'll see already some engagement on these particular people, these particular issues. I think it's so important. And it highlights an issue that I see in the legal regime as well, which is the legacy of the Karimov regime and the continuing need for transitional justice to bring to light and correct injustices and move more and more to a regime based on human rights and rule of law. This is the same issue that you see in the legal regime. There's a continuing approach in many ways of a control mindset for religious organizations and activities, that it's the government's responsibility to make sure that they don't ever do anything wrong. And I think eventually over time, we will see more of a transition to a rule of law and human rights perspective, where the focus is on limiting the powers of the government and justifying them so that they're necessary, justified, and proportionate, rather than assuming that they have carte blanche to regulate religious life. A little bit about the law that was passed last year that was mentioned. First, I want to say I'm so grateful for the government of Uzbekistan. You can tell that there's been sustained engagement on these issues in the current presidential administration. They've been very cooperative. As early as 2017, Dr. Shaheed was able to have a mission to Uzbekistan and offer recommendations. 2018, you see the first draft law to replace the old 1998 law. And they received international feedback, have made a number of changes, a revised version that came out in 2020. And at this time, they have engaged very significantly with the international community, met with experts from a wide range of countries, received comments from Special Rapporteur, OSCE. I'm grateful for the chance to have added some comments as well. So what I'm going to do is just take a few minutes and list some of the improvements that we see under the new law and some of the issues that still remain to be addressed to bring them into standard with international norm. The improvements we've seen, we saw is a simplification of the process of registration, reducing the number of members from 100 to 50, which is quite significant for new villages trying to get off the ground. The elimination of the involvement of the mahallas in the registration process to simplify it. Limiting the time the government has to act on registration applications from 3 months to 1 month. Limiting the grounds where government officials can deny registration. Dropping the requirement for state approval of leaders of religious organizations, at least when these are Uzbek citizens. It still retains the requirement in other places. Although the law continues to require a pre-distribution review or censorship of all religious materials, it does limit the grounds for state officials to carry out, to limit the religious content. And I'll say more on that in a minute. The law allows conversion, per se, for the first time, which is promising, although any attempts to proselyte or share religious beliefs are banned. So it's merely the person being converted that has the right to change. But that's an important human right, to be able to change one's religion. And I applaud them for that. And then there's other technical issues that have been improved, accepting a system of warnings and opportunity to cure to give a less restrictive way for the government to address violations of law rather than just liquidating the organizations. So I think that they show good faith and efforts. There are, however, issues that continue to need addressing, and I'm sure we'll continue to have dialogue on these issues over time. One is the mandatory registration of religious organizations that comes together with a bar on illegal religious activity. This violates the right of everyone to manifest their religion individually and collectively without formal registration. Censorship issues. This, of course, violates international protections of freedom of belief and speech. They move the grounds, as I said, closer to international standards. Under international law, you can only ban materials that present an imminent threat of violence. And here they did tie it to violence, but they also still have some excessively vague standards, like violation of interconfessional harmony and religious tolerance, which sadly is vague enough so that it allows for some arbitrary action. I think we've seen some of that happening, at least reports of it coming out. Also, the ban on private teaching of religion or ban on sharing of religious beliefs that violates international protections of freedom of speech and freedom of religious belief. Non-coercive, persuasive speech and teachings of religious beliefs are protected under international norms, and that should be reflected in law. As Dr. Shaheed mentioned, one of the issues is the prohibition of activities that offend the beliefs of believers in religion. The problem here is sort of taking what would normally be a defamation law and expanding it to include ideas and organizations. The UN Human Rights Committee specifically addressed these and stated that these kinds of laws should not be used to limit freedom of speech. We must not penalize non-verifiable or true statements. The registration process needs somewhat simplification. As I mentioned, this is an area of progress, but membership requirements are still higher than in all the non-Central Asian OSCE region, for example, and some other bureaucratic hurdles. But as I said, there's certain progress in that realm. And finally, the importance of protecting religious autonomy, the right for groups to select their own leadership. There's some progress here, but there's still restrictions on who may head religious organizations and the requirement that foreign heads of religious organizations be accredited by the Ministry of Justice. And of course, the issue that's very problematic for Muslim groups, that religious organizations that have central management bodies have to be approved by those bodies. And that's a significant violation of freedom of religious belief. When you give one existing religious organization or leaders veto over the legal entity status rights of other organizations, even if they share broadly the same faith. I'm hopeful that some of these problems could be addressed in implementing regulations for the new law, and I would encourage the government of Uzbekistan to engage with international experts in drafting regulations. And I just want to say, finally, I really do understand the concerns that drive so many of these restrictive provisions, the concerns of violent extremism. When you put that together with the legacy of a control mentality when it comes to religion, you see there's also what we're seeing elsewhere in Central Asia. Unfortunately, this is not terribly unusual in the region. I it's unfortunate because even though it seems intuitive, research actually proves the opposite, that government restrictions increase social hostilities instead of decrease them. And that in particular, there's been research done just on registration laws, that restrictive legislation laws over time undermine security and again, increase the likelihood of religion-related violence. And that's because when you force groups out of the system, and I think this was mentioned earlier by Steve and Nadine, you limit the positive social contributions of these groups. You legitimize narratives they may have that they're persecuted, and erodes trust between civil society and state. It leads to groups moving underground, which makes them more difficult to regulate or find out information on their activities, encourages dominant religious communities to engage in violence, and isolates minorities in a way that can increase radicalization. So I return to what I said in the beginning. We're grateful very much to the government of Uzbekistan for taking steps forward. I think that really needs to be commended. In this region, Uzbekistan has been a leader in trying to push for change. I think there's still much that needs to be done, but I think that the 2021 law is at least a step in the right direction. And I'm hoping it will have continued opportunities to develop a rule of law culture and a culture of human rights, and greater understanding of those in the government and community in Uzbekistan. So thank you again.
Thank you so much, Professor Clark, and thank you all for your presentation. So as you can imagine, I've received many questions, but maybe before starting, as this seminar is meant to be a dialogue, I would like to give Steve or maybe USCIRF Chair Nadine Mines a chance to answer Ambassador Vahabov or any other point which were raised during the presentations. And of course, I invite any of our panelists to jump into the conversation if they wish. So Steve or Nadine, would you like to answer anything?
Sure, Nadine, should I start? Well, thank you again. And you know, Ambassador Vahabov, I really appreciate, again, the fact of your presence on this panel speaks so highly of the value you place on engagement. And this is obviously, many of these points are controversial. We're talking about extremism and terrorism, never an easy issue. So I really appreciate that. And I should say that one thing, certainly we don't always agree, but one thing you can have certainly trust, faith, confidence in is that you will always receive hopefully critical, informative, detailed analysis and feedback from the work from the human rights community, something I certainly try to promote. And I just wanted to respond in part. First, I want to report some more happy news. While we've been on this Zoom, one of the very respected activists in the area of religious freedom on the Zoom with us, Gulnora Faizieva, reported and confirmed the release of 2 more prisoners on the list. Mohammed Rashidov, arrested in 2018, also Muhammadjon Ahmadjonov, imprisoned in 2017. They were released again on March 18th, so very recently, within less than a month ago. So that's very important. And I, Ambassador Vahabov, I'd love to know more about the names of those released. If you can share that, that would be really, really useful to know. Now, I wanted to mention that in terms of the issue, again, that I was underlining about ideological extremism versus violent extremism. One thing that I noted in the course of this research that was interesting, that yes, while Hizb ut-Tahrir is an outlawed organization, it was stressed and emphasized by the government in my meetings with them that in 2020, for example, the reputed head of Hizb ut-Tahrir, Hafizullah Nasirov, was released. And so therefore it seemed incongruous, somehow inconsistent, or at least begging further examination. Again, as you said, a need for case-by-case examination of many of these individuals, those members of some alleged or some actual members of Hizb ut-Tahrir, because I think, again, in contrast to what you were saying about the efforts to repatriate women and children from formerly ISIS-controlled territory was laudable and important, and was something that Western European nations, for example, were not doing that Uzbekistan was doing. Why not apply that same updated approach to rehabilitation to the population of prisoners who have been, in some cases, in prison for 20 years, for 25 years? I think that should be done. A word on the methodology, because it was stated that perhaps the report in some sense was based on personal assumptions or calculations. I should just underline that the research was based on 113 interviews, many with former prisoners, their relatives, lawyers, and with the government. What would be helpful, though, of course, would be a finding, an accounting or further transparency from the government about the actual numbers. Now, I should note that yesterday's country report on human rights released by the State Department confirmed and further reinforced the report's finding of approximately, again, it's an approximate number of 2,200 religious prisoners. And I think that's important, but the only way to move this forward, I think, would be to have further transparency on that account from the government. So thank you for that, for allowing me to respond.
And I'll just jump in here to say I appreciate all your presentations, and of course, Ambassador, especially you being willing to be here and dialogue with us so openly. It's really unprecedented. So it's an honor for all of us to be a part, and for you to trust us enough to be so honest. You know, it is clear that we heard about a real threat of extremism, and so even when we're meeting with human rights activists who were concerned about different situations, they all pretty much would say that conditions are better than they were in the past, and that, yeah, there is some fear of this. So I think Professor Clark, what you had said, that control mindset, you know, dealing with that real threat, working past that control mindset is really the way forward, you know, to finding, you know, this rule of law and human rights that are healthy for the society. What we found really, I think, in the registration changes, and so what we had found is that while so many, you know, like clearly the registration process has been simplified, it's still complex and multi-layered. And so what we had found, honestly, that some people in the Committee of Religious Affairs of the Ministry of Justice had not received applications because they had not made their way through the local process. And although the Mahala is no longer officially a part, it does seem sometimes they do have some influence still. So some things, you know, to change so quickly and so dramatically. I mean, it feels like we're nitpicking to say, but, you know, here, but these are like the little things that are still being moved in the right direction, but still needing to be moved. So, you know, I feel even encouraged just hearing all of the specific things that are all really doable things that could help to continue this really wonderful reform that's been going on in the country.
Thank you so much. So maybe I'm going to ask, as I said, we received many questions. We won't be able to address all of them, unfortunately, but maybe the first one. I mean, the USCIRF report addresses religious prisoners. So could maybe Chair Nadine Maenza or Steve define what USCIRF means exactly by religious prisoners? I mean, I specified that this definition is given in the report, but it's important for our audience to understand if our panelists agree on this definition, because this obviously has significant impact on the question of freedom of religion, how the question of freedom of religion is addressed.
Right. So I think that for USCIRF, you know, we have a religious prisoners of conscience project. We keep a religious prisoners database. So it's very clearly someone who's been arrested because of their religious beliefs, or actions they've taken that are religious based. So we're very narrow in how we approach that term.
Just to add really quickly on that, you know, Uzbekistan signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights in about 1995 or 1996, and one of those fundamental rights is the freedom of religion and belief. And so when we talk about political prisoners, which is a conversational, you know, informal term in a way that's not precisely defined in international law, but that essentially means that a fundamental right in an international human rights instrument is being violated, one of those being religious freedom. And so for shorthand purposes, a lot of human rights organizations over the years to sort of define this subcategory of political prisoners have talked about religious prisoners, which is an even less defined term in international law. But I use it in the report and I define it in the methodology section as being related to Uzbekistan's voluntary commitments under the international human rights instruments it has signed.
Thank you. There is a very specific question. Is there any reliable longitudinal data on religious political prisoners in Uzbekistan that is collected and reported on an annual basis?
Should I come in on that one? As I wrote in the chat, the State Department yesterday did mention 2,200 religious prisoners in the report. I think that was based on the USCIRF report, but could be much more well-defined if the government was able to engage a little bit further on this. There may be other figures. And again, I should stress that the change in the population was significant. In 2014, there were 44,000 prisoners. By 2020, 22 or 23,000 prisoners. And we know that hundreds, if not thousands, of religious prisoners were released, a large number since 2016. So that change has been dramatic, but we still could use more precise data on the numbers of persons precisely convicted on the extremism charges that were listed during the presentation today.
Okay, thank you, Steve. A question, a problem which was raised by Professor Shaheed is a ban on obtaining a passport or a driver's license in a hijab. So the question asked by one of our attendee is, have you discussed with the authorities on these issues and what specific steps are being taken by USCIRF to improve the situation with ensuring the rights to freedom of religion?
I'll go ahead and jump in since you mentioned USCIRF. So, we have long advocated for women and girls to be able to express, their beliefs by wearing hijab for headscarves. And I did just see schoolgirls, leaving school with headscarves, a lot of religious clothing throughout the country. Totally different than when I was there 2 years ago, a huge increase in the amount of religious clothing. So, we will continue to encourage the government to let people show their religious beliefs that way. We haven't, I wasn't aware, I haven't interacted on the driver's license, but we would again recommend that people be able to wear their religious clothing at all, in all situations like this.
Anyone else wants to jump into the conversation? No? Okay, so let's move to the next question. So you explain, in the USCIRF report that the targets are independent Muslims. And I quote the report, being independent does not necessarily imply rejecting traditional religious practice nor an intent to join the political opposition or overthrow the government. Rather, these individuals are treated as inherently suspect by the state because express their religious beliefs outside specifically state parameters. So the question is, what are these parameters, which obviously have a strong impact on freedom of religion and how religion is managed in Uzbekistan? And did you see any evolution of how these parameters are defined and used by the political authorities, in particular under President Mirziyoyev, which would allow us maybe to hope for an improvement in religious freedom? Anyone wants to answer that?
If I may, well, again, my information dated, I've been there, I was there 5 years ago. But the basic point here is that the parameters are defined in limitations regime for religious freedom, which is that the basic situation should be that people should be able to manifest their faith in worship, observance, practice, and teaching anywhere, so long as that doesn't disrupt public safety or undermine public safety or public order. And of course, there are other issues as well. But again, when limiting, it must be the least intrusive way of doing that and must be proportionate to the legitimate goal that is sought. So the de facto situation would be people are able to practice their faith anywhere, their homes, their offices, or whatever, without disrupting, of course, the public order, public safety, and others, and of course, rights of the people. That's a very high bar. Whereas what we see in some countries where there's a very strong focus, secularism is a very low bar on this. That they like to, in fact, empty the public space of any, if you like, religious practice. And in Uzbekistan, what I find is that legacy of that strong secular attachment, which is playing into, if you like, this limitation of expression of faith in different contexts. And of course, I also want to make a broader pitch here. That is that very often we speak to governments, and our approach is to change government practice, change government law, and the state-based activity. What is missing often, and of course, many of us in fact do engage in this area, is the importance of educating society, engaging at that level, building bottom up as well. Because if society doesn't have the appetite to see people practice their faith freely, then of course state is in a different situation, in a difficult position. So while we insist on, of course, government changing its laws, we must also invest efforts in creating more literacy on human rights, more literacy on religious freedom itself, and of course, in Uzbekistan's case, more literacy on religion itself. Because without that literacy, in this case, Islam primarily, people remain vulnerable to all sorts of, if you like, indoctrination that may lead to serious concern. So the government has a problem here. So something I've been recommending, I hope to follow up with Ambassador, is doing what the UN calls the Faith for Rights workshop with a variety of stakeholders in the country, whereby what we do is we bring people of all faiths and none into one place and look at, from peer-to-peer exchanges, how they can all advance towards human rights perspective from their own positions. So therefore, they actually learn to tolerate or accept or in fact respect a whole range of diverse ways of being without necessarily feel that's a threat to their own existence, on society. But this is a reality we have to face, that while we demand this, and rightly so we should demand this, and we hope they get some traction in the country, we must also engage at the other level, that of creating that space whereby there is more respect at societal level as well. When I met the president on then my visit, he was telling me that, on my recommendation on people should be able to preach in the public, he said, if people did this in the village, there'd be an uproar and chaos and a mob. Now, I get that challenge, but the answer is not there for stopping at it. The answer is finding a way to avoid that mob violence, mob reaction, or if you like, uncomfortable reaction, by educating people, engaging people, of course, and protecting the people who do the preaching rather than having that person arrested. So it's a balance between ensuring the rights for all are protected, but also making sure that we also find ways to build a space in society for the rights to be exercised. Thank you.
Anyone else? No. Okay, maybe let's move to the next question. So we have questions on religious minorities. So when we talk about religious prisoners, a majority are Muslims, but are there today, the first question is, are there today people practicing all other religions? So Christians, for example, considered as religious prisoners, and could you say a few words on that, what happened? And what are the exact blocks to registering Christian churches? Are there particular government concerns? So please go ahead, Sylvia.
Well, let me leave the registration issues and other obstacles to my other panelists, and maybe Ambassador Vahaba wants to weigh in. But just on prisoners, I wanted to say that one of the positive developments or trajectories that we outline in the report is that, in contrast to 20 years ago or to 10 years ago, at the time of doing this research, I uncovered no prisoners, for example, there used to be Baptists, there used to be Jehovah's Witnesses actually in prison. Now, that's not to say that there are not serious obstacles to observance of religious freedom. But in terms of prisoners, as far as my research was able to uncover, there were no current religious prisoners of concern from Christian communities. So that's just one thing I wanted to underline.
Maybe I'll jump in and add that in terms of registration, it's actually been, as I understand it, exclusively Christian organizations that have been registered. There were a flurry of registration around the time the law was introduced in 2020, and as slow steady trickle since then. And I think it's important, and I think it's great that Christian organizations are being registered, but I think it's equally important to make sure that minority Muslim or other groups that may not be popular are registered as well. It's equally important in terms of religious freedom. this question of people who, there's a question also in the chat about people who don't believe. I know that was something that we recommended to put in the law explicitly, that atheists, agnostics, those who do not choose not to affiliate, should not be penalized or discriminated against. And I don't believe that made it into the final version of the law, unfortunately. I mean, under international norms, it is considered, the norm is freedom of religion or belief. And so to the extent that it states some general principles, there's reasons courts should interpret it, but it probably needs to be more specifically articulated. And one last thing to the thing that Dr. Shaheed mentioned about the international norms. I saw a couple questions on the chat about that. The norms I've been referring to are not US law and not even laws from Western Europe or elsewhere in the world. I'm looking at the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which Uzbekistan is a party, OSCE norms, which Uzbekistan is part of, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's internal Uzbekistan, the Constitution, and so forth. I think that those are the ones that I believe Dr. Shaheed's been referring to as well, that if I can speak for you, please stop me if I'm wrong. But that those are the international community we look at to see for individual countries if they're meeting up to the commitments that they've been into.
Thank you, Professor Clark. Ambassador Vahabov, would you like to add anything?
Yes, if I may. With regard to what Steve actually has mentioned, of course, I can check with my colleagues in Tashkent, but in the meantime, I can confirm that there are no persons in prison right now representing those religious minorities. In Uzbekistan. And as I have mentioned earlier, since we've actually launched this close cooperation with the United States government and other non-governmental stakeholders, 25 non-Muslim, mostly Christian churches, have been registered within the Justice Minister of Uzbekistan. It was unthinkable prior to 2016. And with regard to those individuals, again, representing these religious minorities, Ms. Mayanta knows well, we've been closely working on every single request that has been addressed to my government, and all those people who actually were brought to my attention, have been already released. And I would like also again to repeat that after the adoption of this pretty outdated, I would say, law on religious freedom, 9 religious organizations have been registered in Tashkent, Karakol, Pakistan, Surkhandarya and Navoiy regions. Again, it was unimaginable to see these kind of non-Muslim religious organizations to get registered within the Justice Ministry. And with respect to Steve, to the names of those 81 people that you have mentioned in your report. While visiting Tashkent and other regions of my home country, the USCIRF delegation led by Ms. Mayans has made a kind request addressing to the Uzbekistan officials to provide the names and data, proving the charge, with respect to all those 81 persons, especially those who have been already released. And currently I'm working with my colleagues from the Uzbekistan law enforcement agencies, and hopefully very soon we'll be able to provide these requested info. I would like just to commend the work, tremendous work that has been done by Dr. Clark while reviving this 23 years old law on religious freedom. And as I had mentioned earlier, we know that the adoption of this law still raises some criticism. However, some our red lines should be respected, in my understanding. So in particular, with respect to obligatory requirement for any religious group to register their religious organization, or in admissibility of missionary activity, or even proselytism or other activities aimed at coercively converting others, so private religious educations that may lead to destructive interpretations of religion. So all that are at this moment, just would like to underscore, very critical, so for Uzbekistan, and just cannot be removed overnight because of its significant impact on existing delicate balance in interreligious and interfaith relations in Uzbekistan. Just before you give the floor to other panelists, just taking this opportunity, I would like to note that this year on May 16th, 19th, together with our partners from the Institute of Global Engagement, Templeton Religious Trust, Brigham Young University, Multi-Faith Neighbors Network, and others. So we are planning to convene a dialogue of declarations, a week-long conference of several activities that will consider the Muslim majority world's engagement of religious freedom, religious literacy, covenantal pluralism, social harmony, gender issues, extremism, and citizenship. And as an outcome of this conference, would like to adopt the so-called Bukhara Declaration that we are currently working on, and declarations that will reflect the principles of Autonomy Declaration adopted within the Ministerial on advancing religious freedom in 2018, Jakarta and Marrakesh declarations as well, and the United Nations General Assembly special resolution entitled Enlightenment and Religious Tolerance, initiated by Uzbekistan, and other international principles. And I would like to invite you all to this milestone event. And Dr. Shaheed, I actually salute this incredible work that we've been doing together over the last four and a half years since you visited my home country, and I actually welcome your offer to implement training programs in partnership with the Ralph Bunche Institute, City University of New York, and the Human Rights Center at the University of Essex, where you are currently working, as far as I know, and standing ready to arrange your trip to Uzbekistan. Again, Dr. Perry, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with good friends of mine.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Vahabov. I mean, we're very unfortunately running out of time, but maybe I would just, before we close this seminar, I would like to give the opportunity to our other panelists to say any brief concluding remarks, if they wish. Anyone? Yes, Professor Shahid, sure.
Just two things sentences here. I mean, I want to say I recognize the challenges ahead of the country. I also want to appreciate the openness with which you have met us today, Ambassador, and of course the offer you of making to us to remain engaged with you, which is very hopeful. We will follow up. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Just want to reiterate again how glad I am to be here, and thank you again for hosting this. And Ambassador, once again, it's an honor and a privilege to continue to work with you, and look forward to visiting your beautiful country soon.
Likewise, I just want to thank everyone for their contributions, and again, state that I know it's not an easy conversation, so it's commendable that we're able to have that. I'm looking forward to reporting more news of the releases, and I hope we will continue to work together closely on all these issues.
Professor Clark.
I just want to say the same. I think that it really is remarkable. I've worked in many countries on these kinds of issues, and Uzbekistan far and away has had the most engagement from the side of the government. in terms of being willing and open for foreign experts to engage, to have private meetings on legislation, to talk through issues, and in public engagements like this. And I think, while everyone may not agree on where the red lines should be, right? But I think it's so important that we have these kinds of opportunities. And I really am just so grateful that that you and your government have been willing to engage in areas where you're often criticized. And I think that's remarkable.
Thank you so much. So again, yes, unfortunately, we need to conclude. So I would really like to thank our 5 panelists who agreed to be with us today, despite their extremely busy schedule. It was very important for us today to address this topic and religious freedom in Uzbekistan, but also to give everyone a voice and to enable the exchange of opinions, even contradictory ones, which is actually the very essence of dialogue and progress in region and in many other areas of human rights and politics. So a huge thank you to Chair Nadine Menzas, to Steve Swerdlow, to Professor Ahmed Shaheed, to Ambassador Vahabov, and to Professor Elizabeth Clark. I would also like to thank our audience for being with us today and for the discussion, and we look forward to having you again in one of our upcoming seminars and to continue our discussions on our beloved regions of Central Asia. So thank you all. I wish you a good afternoon or a good evening or a good night. Thank you very much. Goodbye.